Correcting mistakes. We should do what we can to correct the results of our mistakes before passing our leadership role to our successors. Here's Gene to explain.
David had made a lot of mistakes. Serious mistakes. But you see, I believe, as you look at the passage, he did what he could to practice this principle, this very significant principle, before he died, to correct the results of those mistakes, at least those that related particularly to the whole nation of Israel and to dealing with issues that were not just personal, but these were criminal activities. And as the king, he was responsible to deal with criminal activities, and he bypassed some of those situations. And it led to some serious problems. And I think from this passage we see that David definitely wanted Solomon to have a fresh start. He didn't want him to have to see the results of this going on and on in his particular kingship. So, notice what we read in 1 Kings chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. As the time approached for David to die, he instructed his son Solomon, "As for me, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, be courageous, like a man. Keep your obligations to the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes, commands, ordinances, and decrees." And isn't it interesting that he has strength now to do some of the things that he didn't do before, as he comes into the end of his life, to be very direct and very straightforward with his son, Solomon, because he doesn't want him to fall into the same mistakes that he made. And so he goes on in what he said to Solomon. This is written in the law of Moses. He goes back, you see, to the law that he had violated himself. He reviews that for his son Solomon. This is written in the law of Moses so that you will have success in everything you do and wherever you turn, and so that the Lord will carry out his promise that he made to me. And then he quotes that promise that was made to him personally by the Lord. If your sons are careful to walk faithfully before me with their whole mind and heart, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. And as you go on in this passage, you find out what those mistakes were, those serious mistakes. For example, David had not dealt with 2 murders that Joab had committed. The interesting thing is that, again, David probably didn't deal with that because of his own sin. See, this spread out beyond his family. And so he instructs Solomon to deal with his criminal activity. He warned Solomon to keep an eye on Shimei, who had uttered malicious curses against David. David had forgiven him, but he also knew that he was a very subtle man, and he had said some terrible things about David. Though they were true, he just says, watch him, because he could indeed create a problem. The fact is, he did. But see, David is warning him for the future. It's interesting that, as I said, when you look at these things that are reviewed by David for his son, just remind yourself that he's dealing with criminal activity. This is criminal activity. And since David had avoided dealing with these issues, he's warning Solomon. He did not want his sin to come on Solomon. And that's significant because this takes us back to something that was said in the book of Numbers through God's revelation to Israel before they even went into the promised land. And we read, "The Lord is slow to anger and rich in faithful love, forgiving wrongdoing and rebellion." Boy, do we ever see that in David's life. Do we ever see God's grace in David's life? And we see that throughout the New Testament. But we also read, "He will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's wrongdoing on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation." In other words, I think David is saying, Solomon, I don't want my sins to impact you. In other words, we can change this. It doesn't have to go on and on if you do something about it. And so this is a very important reminder, you see, for Solomon in relationship to David's sin and passing it on to the next generation. Now, we, of course, as believers, we're not living under the law. We're not living under this Mosaic direction, the laws that were given to control this community. And David was responsible for the whole community, not just spiritually, but legally and culturally. I mean, it was the whole community of Israel. Now, what happened as time went on, we are under government control that is far beyond the nation Israel, as it's illustrated here. We have laws or God's will which says we're not to take the law into our own hands and to do things that are designed for the government to protect us. And so we have a responsibility to be alert to what is wrong, to pray for our government, to hope and pray that our government will deal in an appropriate way with criminal activity, and that's what we're dealing with in this situation. But at the same time, though Paul says we're to respect government as being ordained by God, he warned against people who are evil. And he gives personal witness to this when he wrote to Timothy. He's in his final imprisonment. He knows that he's going to be giving his life for the gospel. And he warned Timothy, and he was very specific. He said, watch out for Alexander the coppersmith, because Alexander the coppersmith did great harm to me. Then he said, the Lord will repay him according to his works. In other words, I'm not to take the law into my own hands. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. That's in essence what he has in mind here. But watch out for him yourself, because he is strongly opposed to our words. In other words, there is a principle here whereby we need to be aware of those people who are evil as it relates to our lives, our personal lives, and our families' lives, and all of that. So that's another realm that we need to be alert to. So Paul warned Timothy against this man, Alexander the coppersmith. That sounds like what David did when he warned Solomon against Shimei. You see a correlation there. He warned him against this man who could do evil. And unfortunately it happened, and Solomon had to deal with that. But there's another side to this that we have to remember, and that is the whole area of forgiveness. Living under the new covenant, Paul taught Timothy forgiveness. You see this in the next verse in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16. At my first defense, no one stood by me, but everyone deserted me. May it not be counted against them. Boy, that's forgiveness. Yes, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But even within some of these very difficult situations, we are to forgive even our enemies. And so Paul says, watch out for these evil people. At the same time, have a spirit of forgiveness. Don't be naive, but remember that God calls us to forgive even our enemies. It's not wrong to pray for justice, but we also should pray for a spirit of forgiveness. So, the reflection response question: though justice for criminal activity is a government responsibility under the new covenant, in what ways can we correct the results of our mistakes in all of our relationships? And here we can get very practical. We're dealing here in this Old Testament setting, New Testament setting, some very, very serious situations. But I think that the principle applies to just life generally. For example, as a father, and I've shared this with some of you, there came a point in my life where I had to say to my son Kenton, please forgive me for my busyness and allowing the ministry at times to take me away from you as my son. Now, I did that. Nobody forced me to do that. But it impacted my son. And we had to have a very good conversation, and he forgave me when I asked for forgiveness. But I said to him at the same time, don't repeat my mistakes. Don't repeat my mistakes. And he took that to heart, and I can see it in his life today in terms of his relationship to his own children. Sometimes I don't even know how he does it. In terms of demands on his time as a businessman, demands of family life. But boy, he is really, really concerned about giving time to his children, who, by the way, most of them are involved in athletics. I only had one son who was involved. He has 4 sons that are involved in athletics. And yet, I see him practicing that principle. What I'm simply saying is that there are times when we need to say, forgive me and don't repeat my mistakes. And I think, in essence, David is saying that to Solomon. I remember my daughter said to her son, and she talked about this and shared it, when he got his driver's license. And she said this just recently. She said, I told him, please don't drive like I did. And then she told me of some of the times when she drove home from college and the speed at which she came home. It made me frightened in some respects. But that son listened. See, it's not wrong to admit our mistakes. They won't say, well, you hypocrite, if we're sincere, because we're trying to protect them. I know a couple. Before they were believers, they lived together. Then they became Christians. After they were married, they did get married and they became Christians. And they sat down with each of their children and say, look, when we were unsaved, this is the life we lived. We now have a new code of ethics and morality, now that we're believers. And we're telling you, don't repeat our mistakes. And I know those children have listened to that. So in a sense, I think that's what David has done here with his son Solomon. We have a very significant principle. So let me just restate the principle. Correcting mistakes. We should do what we can to correct the results of our mistakes before passing our leadership role to our successors. But I've said here that does apply to us, even as parents, with our own children.